Imagine stepping into an 18th century church where walls seem to come alive with golden sculptures and paintings that tell stories of faith and power. But what you might not know is that behind this breathtaking beauty lies a clash of cultures, a blend of indigenous African and European traditions. Welcome to the world of Baroque in the Americas. Baroque arrived in the Americas with European colonizers, but here it took on an entirely new face. In churches, Jesuit missions, and even music, the Baroque style transformed, incorporating elements from local cultures. This video will take you on a journey through Aleijadinho's masterpieces in Brazil, the Jesuit missions in South America, and the Baroque music that echoed through colonial cities. The story of American Baroque is unlike any other chapter in art history. When European aesthetics collided with the vibrant artistic traditions of the New World, something extraordinary happened. In cities from Mexico to Peru to Brazil, a new artistic language emerged, more dramatic, more emotional, and infused with the spirit of three continents. What makes this story so fascinating is how indigenous and African artists weren't just copying European styles, they were reinventing them. Local craftsmen carved angels with native features, painted saints with local landscapes, and constructed churches that blended Old World grandeur with New World materials. This wasn't just art. It was cultural dialogue written in stone and gold. The colonial powers may have intended to simply transplant European Baroque to assert their dominance, but the result was something far more interesting. A visual revolution that tells us as much about resistance as it does about conversion. If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of great empires like this video, subscribe to the Modern Age Chronicles channel and don't miss a single episode. Let's begin with architecture, the most visible face of Baroque in the Americas. Colonial churches, with their elaborate facades and richly decorated interiors, stood as powerful symbols of faith and imperial might. Walking into these spaces was meant to overwhelm your senses, exactly as the European powers intended. In Brazil, the Church of São Francisco in Salvador is a breathtaking example. Nearly every surface shimmers with gold, creating an almost heavenly atmosphere when sunlight streams through the windows. The effect is intentionally dazzling, designed to inspire both devotion and awe. But here's what most history books won't tell you. Many of these intricate details were actually crafted by indigenous and African artists, who subtly blended their own traditions into the European style. Look closely at the cherubs in these churches. You might notice they sometimes have indigenous features, or examine the floral patterns that often incorporate native plants unknown in Europe. These weren't accidents or artistic liberties, they were quiet expressions of cultural identity woven into the fabric of colonial art. In Mexico, the stunning Cathedral of Puebla showcases another fascinating aspect of American Baroque, the use of local materials like Talavera tiles that gave Mexican churches their distinctive character. Meanwhile, in Peru, architects combined Spanish Baroque elements with earthquake-resistant construction techniques developed by Inca builders. Did you know that in some Jesuit missions, the priests actually allowed indigenous artists to incorporate elements of their traditional beliefs into religious artwork? In Paraguay and Argentina, you can find angels playing native instruments and biblical scenes set against landscapes that look suspiciously like local terrain. This created a fusion so unique that you won't find anything like it anywhere else in the world. What makes American Baroque architecture truly special isn't just its grandeur, it's these hidden conversations between cultures. When European Baroque crossed the Atlantic, it didn't simply replicate, it transformed, becoming something both familiar and revolutionary. These churches weren't just places of worship, they were spaces where cultures collided and created something entirely new. The next time you see images of American Baroque churches, look beyond the golden glory. Look for the subtle signatures of the forgotten artists who, despite working under colonial rule, managed to leave their cultural fingerprints on some of the most magnificent buildings in the Western Hemisphere. Speaking of remarkable artists, we cannot overlook Antonio Francisco Lisboa, known as Aleijadinho, the Little Cripple. Born in Minas Gerais in the mid-18th century, he is considered one of the greatest figures of Baroque art in the Americas. His story is as extraordinary as his work. Imagine this, a time when Brazil's gold mines were fueling an artistic renaissance, and from this golden era emerged a sculptor whose hands would themselves become twisted by disease. Aleijadinho was the son of a Portuguese architect and an enslaved African woman, embodying in his very blood the cultural fusion that defined American Baroque. By his 40s, Aleijadinho developed a mysterious degenerative disease. Some historians believe it was leprosy, others suggest syphilis or even rheumatoid arthritis. This condition gradually deformed his hands and feet, eventually causing him to lose his fingers and toes. But rather than surrender to his affliction, he adapted. When he could no longer hold his tools properly, Aleijadinho had them strapped to his arms and continued working. His masterpiece, the 12 Prophets at the Sanctuary of Bom Jesus de Matosinhos in Congonhas do Campo, will leave you speechless. These larger-than-life soapstone figures seem to defy gravity. Their robes appear to billow in the wind, their expressions intense and alive. What makes this even more remarkable is that he created these works while suffering excruciating pain, climbing scaffolding with tremendous difficulty, working in the darkness of dawn to avoid the public gaze. There's something both haunting and magical about these prophets. They don't look typically European. Their features reflect Brazil's mixed heritage, a subtle rebellion against colonial aesthetic standards. Look closely at the prophet Daniel, whose face some believe resembles Aleijadinho himself, a hidden signature in stone. The irony of Aleijadinho's life is profound. As his body deteriorated, his artistic vision soared. He carved not just biblical figures, but the very identity of Brazilian art, creating a style that was neither Portuguese, nor African, nor indigenous, but uniquely Brazilian. Local legends tell that Aleijadinho worked under cover of night, his face hidden behind a veil, accompanied only by slaves who carried him when he could no longer walk. While some of these details may be embellished, they speak to how his figure has become almost mythical in Brazilian culture, a symbol of triumph over seemingly impossible odds. His passion for his art was so consuming that when asked why he continued to work despite his suffering, he reportedly answered, "The Creator must complete his creation." In his lifetime, Aleijadinho created over 400 works, transforming the religious art of Brazil forever. Today, his sculptures continue to inspire not just for their artistic brilliance, but as a testament to human resilience. When you look at Aleijadinho's work, you're witnessing more than Baroque splendor. You're seeing the power of creative spirit to transcend physical limitations and create beauty that endures for centuries. Let's journey now to the southern regions of the continent, where the Jesuits established something truly remarkable. These weren't just simple churches or outposts. They were entire self-sufficient cities, carefully planned communities where European and indigenous worlds collided in fascinating ways. In the dense forests and rolling plains spanning what is now Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil, the Jesuits built over 30 missions between the 16th and 18th centuries. These settlements, known as reductions, were designed to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity, while supposedly protecting them from slave traders. But what emerged was something far more complex than a simple colonial project. Picture this. Settlements with perfectly laid out streets, magnificent churches at their centers, workshops, schools, and agricultural lands all around. These missions were architectural marvels in their own right, combining European urban planning with practical adaptations to the South American landscape. What makes these missions particularly fascinating is how Baroque art became a visual language, a bridge between two vastly different worlds. The Jesuits faced a fundamental challenge. How do you communicate complex religious concepts to people who speak entirely different languages? Their answer was through images. Inside the mission churches, walls came alive with vibrant paintings depicting biblical scenes. Elaborate altarpieces told stories of saints and martyrs. Sculptures of angels and biblical figures created a three-dimensional sacred theater. But here's where it gets interesting. Much of this art wasn't created by European masters, but by indigenous artists themselves. The Jesuits would teach indigenous craftspeople European techniques, but what happened next was extraordinary. These indigenous artists didn't simply copy European models, they transformed them. Look closely at a mission altarpiece, and you might notice native plants intertwined with traditional Baroque flourishes. Examine the faces of angels and saints, and you'll find they often bear indigenous features rather than European ones. In the missions of the Guarani people, master woodcarvers created sculptures that blended Catholic imagery with subtle elements from their own spiritual traditions. The angels playing musical instruments in these churches aren't holding European lutes or harps, but often native instruments like maracas or local flutes. It was a quiet form of cultural preservation happening right under the noses of the colonial authorities. At the San Ignacio mini mission in Argentina, the stone carvings feature distinctive plant motifs that would be completely foreign to European eyes, but would be instantly recognizable to local indigenous peoples. These weren't just decorative choices, they were meaningful symbols from Guarani cosmology, subtly incorporated into Christian art. The colors used in mission paintings also tell a story of cultural exchange. Indigenous artists often preferred vibrant reds, yellows, and blues made from local pigments, creating a palette distinctly different from European Baroque art. When these colors were applied to religious scenes, they created a uniquely American interpretation of European themes. Perhaps most remarkably, the Jesuits encouraged musical education in the missions. Indigenous musicians and composers created complex Baroque compositions, blending European musical structures with native rhythms and instrumentation. Imagine the sound of a full orchestra and choir performing in these remote jungle settings. Visitors frequently reported being astonished by the musical sophistication they encountered. The tragic epilogue to this story came in 1767, when the Spanish crown expelled the Jesuits from their colonies. Many missions were abandoned, their communities scattered, their artistic treasures looted or left to decay in the jungle. Today, the haunting ruins of missions like San Ignacio Mini and Trinidad stand as powerful reminders of this unique cultural experiment. Walking through these sites today, you can still feel the ambition of the Jesuit vision and the creative genius of indigenous artists who, working within a colonial framework, nonetheless found ways to express their own cultural identity. The mission ruins are now UNESCO World Heritage Sites, recognized for their exceptional cultural value and the unique artistic fusion they represent. Did you know that indigenous artists left their mark on these Jesuit missions? If you're enjoying this video, please like, share, and subscribe to the Modern Age Chronicles channel for more incredible stories. And tell us in the comments, which Baroque masterpiece would you like to visit? The story of Baroque in the Americas would be incomplete without exploring its most ephemeral, yet perhaps most emotionally powerful dimension: music. While we can still admire colonial churches and sculptures today, the sounds that once filled these spaces have largely vanished into history, yet they were just as revolutionary as their visual counterparts. Imagine yourself standing in the vast cathedral of Mexico City in the late 17th century. The space is already overwhelming, golden altars catching the light of hundreds of candles, incense filling the air. But then the music begins, and the experience transforms into something truly transcendent. a choir of 40 voices begins to sing, accompanied by violins, organs, guitars, and indigenous percussion instruments. The sound reverberates through the massive stone structure, enveloping everyone inside in waves of harmony. What made colonial Baroque music so special wasn't just its technical brilliance, it was how it became the perfect laboratory for cultural fusion. European musical structures collided with African rhythms and indigenous melodic sensibilities, creating something entirely new. In the mining towns of Bolivia, European church music incorporated local Andean flutes. In Brazil, African drumming patterns subtly influenced the rhythmic structures of sacred music. One of the most fascinating stories is that of Manuel de Zumaya, a Mexican composer born in 1680. As chapel master of Mexico City Cathedral, he wrote music that rivaled the greatest European composers of his day. His villancicos, religious songs with lively, dance-like rhythms, incorporated elements from Spanish, African, and indigenous musical traditions. When dignitaries from Spain heard his compositions, they were reportedly astonished that such sophisticated music could emerge from the colonies. Or consider the remarkable musical tradition that emerged in the missions of Bolivia. In isolated Jesuit missions deep in the Amazon basin, indigenous musicians weren't just performing European music. They were composing their own Baroque masterpieces. The Jesuits taught European notation and composition, but local composers brought their own sensibilities to the tradition. Archives discovered in the 20th century revealed thousands of manuscript pages of unique compositions that combined European Baroque structures with distinctly Amazonian elements. Even the instruments themselves tell a story of cultural blending. In colonial Peru, craftsmen created Baroque harps that were adaptations of European instruments, but modified with local woods and construction techniques. These harps produced a uniquely warm, resonant sound that became characteristic of Andean colonial music. In Brazil, the viola de mão, a guitar-like instrument, evolved distinctive playing techniques that blended Portuguese traditions with African rhythmic patterns. Perhaps most poignantly, colonial Baroque music often provided one of the few socially acceptable outlets for artistic expression among enslaved African populations and subjugated indigenous peoples. Through music, marginalized communities could participate in colonial society while subtly preserving elements of their own cultural heritage. The famous Guinean dances that were incorporated into religious festivities throughout Latin America maintained African rhythmic patterns and movement styles despite their outwardly Christian context. One of history's great ironies is that while European powers intended music as a tool of colonization, a way to impose European cultural values, it instead became a vehicle for cultural preservation and subtle resistance. When indigenous choirs sang in Latin or Spanish, they often maintained vocal techniques from their own traditions. When African drummers performed for church processions, they kept alive rhythmic patterns with deep spiritual significance in their ancestral cultures. For centuries, this remarkable musical tradition remained largely forgotten. Colonial archives gathered dust, and the compositions of American Baroque masters were rarely performed. But in recent decades, musicologists and performers have begun rediscovering this lost world of sound. Ensembles specializing in colonial music are bringing these compositions back to life, often performing them in the very churches for which they were written. What's perhaps most remarkable about these rediscovered compositions is how modern they sound to our ears. The cultural fusion that characterizes colonial Baroque music feels strikingly contemporary, a reminder that globalization and cultural exchange aren't just 21st century phenomena, but have been shaping artistic expression for centuries. Listening to a piece by the Bolivian indigenous composer Roque Jacinto de Chavarria, or the mixed-race Brazilian composer José Mauricio Nunes Garcia, reveals not just technical brilliance, but a profound emotional depth. These weren't musicians merely imitating European styles. They were innovative composers, creating uniquely American expressions through sound. Their music wasn't just beautiful, it was revolutionary, a harmonious rebellion against the idea that European art forms were inherently superior. Finally, we cannot truly understand the Baroque in the Americas without acknowledging its most transformative element, the profound influence of indigenous and African cultures. While European colonizers brought Baroque aesthetics across the Atlantic, it was the local artists who breathed new life into this style, creating something that transcended its origins to become uniquely American. When we look at colonial Baroque art with careful eyes, what emerges is not a story of simple imitation, but one of creative adaptation and quiet resistance. Consider the famous angels painted on the ceiling of the Church of San Francisco in Quito, Ecuador. At first glance, they appear to follow European conventions, but look closer. These angels have distinctly indigenous facial features, darker skin tones, and they're playing native instruments like charangos and panpipes rather than European harps or lutes. This pattern repeats throughout the Americas. In the highlands of Peru and Bolivia, paintings of the Virgin Mary often show her in a triangular dress, reminiscent of a mountain, a subtle visual reference to Pachamama, the Andean earth goddess. European religious figures were transformed into something local communities could connect with spiritually and culturally. The African influence on American Baroque is equally fascinating, though often less acknowledged. In cities with large enslaved African populations like Salvador in Brazil or Cartagena in Colombia, African carving techniques and aesthetic sensibilities profoundly shaped local Baroque expression. The rhythmic, dynamic quality of wooden altar carvings in many Brazilian churches bears striking similarities to West African sculptural traditions. Even the distinctive curved lines that characterize much of Brazilian Baroque architecture echo patterns found in African art. One of the most remarkable examples of this cultural fusion can be found in the Church of Santa Maria Tonantzintla near Puebla, Mexico. Here, amid typical Baroque ornamentation, you'll find indigenous corn plants, local fruits, and native flowers. The church's interior is a riot of color and natural imagery that would be entirely foreign to European Baroque churches, but made perfect sense to the indigenous artists who created it and the communities who worshipped there. What's particularly fascinating about these cultural influences is that they weren't just decorative choices. They often carried deep, symbolic meaning. When indigenous artists carved pomegranates into church facades in Peru, they weren't simply reproducing European motifs. They were incorporating a fruit that resembled the sacred coca plant. When African craftsmen incorporated certain geometric patterns into wooden altars in Brazil, they were preserving symbols with spiritual significance from their ancestral traditions. The colonial authorities weren't always oblivious to these subversions. In 1692, the Archbishop of Lima issued an edict prohibiting Indian idols in religious art, explicitly condemning the inclusion of native plants and animals in church decoration. Yet, despite such prohibitions, these elements persisted, tucked into corners, disguised as conventional Baroque flourishes, or sometimes hidden in plain sight. One particular story illustrates this cultural negotiation perfectly. In the Andean church of San Pedro de Andahuaylilas in Peru, indigenous artists painted the path to heaven, lined with both European angels and figures that closely resemble pre-Columbian deities. The Spanish priests either didn't notice or chose to overlook this spiritual blending, what scholars now call religious syncretism. For the indigenous community, this wasn't just art. It was a way of preserving their worldview within the dominant colonial culture. African musical traditions similarly transformed the sound of Baroque in the Americas. In the coastal regions of Colombia and Venezuela, church music incorporated African percussion instruments and rhythmic patterns. In Brazil, The distinctive bouncing rhythm of many Baroque compositions shows clear influences from African musical structures. Even the way choirs sang, with distinctive vocal ornamentations and rhythmic emphasis, often reflected African musical sensibilities. What emerges from all these examples is a profound truth about American Baroque. It wasn't merely European art in a new setting, but a genuinely new artistic language born from cultural conversation, negotiation, and sometimes resistance. While European powers intended Baroque art to reinforce their cultural and religious dominance in the hands of indigenous and African artists, it became something far more complex, a vehicle for cultural survival and expression. This unique fusion created artistic traditions that couldn't possibly have emerged anywhere else. The Mexican Baroque, with its explosive use of color and natural imagery, is distinct from the Brazilian Baroque, which incorporates African rhythmic sensibilities and tropical motifs. The Andean Baroque, with its incorporation of mountain symbolism and indigenous cosmology, is different still. Each region developed its own dialect of this new artistic language. The legacy of this cultural blending continues to shape Latin American identity today. When modern artists, architects, and musicians draw on their cultural heritage, they're often referencing traditions that were forged in this crucible of cultural exchange centuries ago. What began as colonial imposition became, through creative adaptation and resistance, one of the most extraordinary chapters in global art history, a testimony to the power of human creativity to transcend the constraints of power and create beauty even in the most challenging of circumstances. The next time you see images of American Baroque churches, paintings, or sculptures, look beyond their surface beauty. See them as conversations across cultures, as expressions of resilience, and as testament to how art can become a powerful tool for preserving identity even under colonial rule. The Baroque in the Americas isn't just a historical artifact. It's a living reminder of how cultural exchange, even when begun under unequal power relations, can create something genuinely new and enduring. Baroque in the Americas is far more than just an artistic style. It stands as a powerful testament to the complex fusion of cultures that shaped our continent. As we've journeyed through this remarkable period, we've witnessed how European aesthetics collided with indigenous craftsmanship and African influences to create something entirely new and revolutionary. From the breathtaking churches with their gold-covered interiors to Aleijadinho's haunting sculptures carved despite tremendous physical suffering, each creation tells a story far deeper than mere artistic expression. These works speak of resistance, adaptation, and creative transformation during an era of immense cultural upheaval. Think about those magnificent Jesuit missions, where indigenous artists subtly incorporated their own spiritual symbols into Christian imagery. Or consider the colonial Baroque music that blended European harmonies with African rhythms and indigenous melodies, creating sounds that would have been impossible in Europe alone. What makes American Baroque truly extraordinary is how it emerged from unequal power relationships, yet somehow transcended them. Colonial authorities intended Baroque art to reinforce their dominance, but in the hands of indigenous and African artists, it became a vehicle for cultural survival and expression. When an indigenous craftsman carved angels with native features or included local plants in church decorations, they weren't just creating art, they were preserving their identity against tremendous odds. This cultural dialogue, written in stone, gold, and music, continues to influence our identity today. The vibrant colors, emotional intensity, and cultural hybridity that characterize Latin American art can trace their lineage directly back to these colonial Baroque innovations. When modern architects in Mexico, Brazil, or Peru draw on their cultural heritage, they're often referencing artistic traditions first forged in this crucible of cultural exchange centuries ago. So I ask you, What do you think about this cultural fusion? How do you see its influence on our collective identity today? The story of Baroque in the Americas reminds us that even in the most challenging circumstances, human creativity finds ways to flourish and transform. It shows us that cultural identity isn't rigid, but constantly evolving through conversation, negotiation, and sometimes resistance. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, share it with friends who appreciate art history, and subscribe to the Modern Age Chronicles channel for more content about the modern age. Join us next time as we continue exploring the fascinating stories behind history's greatest artistic movements. Until our next video.